day, good afternoon to colleagues across the globe. We are very happy to have you here for our what we call the Coffee Talk series. And today I took the opportunity of inviting a friend of evaluation, Dr. Srini Pillay, who is a clinical psychologist, psychiatrist, and a Harvard professor, also a member of the Transformation Learning Council, and who has worked with me for about 5 years at UNDP in the Independent Evaluation Office, helping us to sort of shift the equation to make evaluation both critical and bring about changes, but also take people along, something that is not easy to do in an accountability function. He has prepared a talk and will talk to about 40 minutes, and thereafter we have an opportunity to field questions. What he's done is quite innovative, but there is a track record of it being successful, where evaluators can actually do both accountability and learning without compromising any of it. So with those few words, and to make the best of the valuable time, to the colleagues on platform, I welcome you, and I hand over to Dr. Srini Pillay to take us through his presentation, and we'll take questions at the end. Thank you very much, Srini. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Indra. It's lovely to be with all of you. Thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts. Today, we're going to be talking about mindset strategies for post-evaluation transformation. And part of what I'd like you to do is to be asking yourselves questions, because, as Indra pointed out, I've founded a company called Neuro Business Group. I also have co-founded a virtual reality technology company. I was trained in psychiatry at Harvard, and then did brain research and directed the outpatient anxiety disorders program, where I started to see a lot of executives and they didn't want treatment. So I started to learn executive coaching, became a certified master executive coach, taught in the business faculties at Harvard Business School and do corporate education. The work has been recognized globally. I now think with McKinsey about the future of learning and teach on LinkedIn. And I'm also a member of the Transformational Leadership Council. Now, the reason I'm giving you this perspective is because despite my background in thinking about anxiety and human development and thinking about leadership, I always say I both believe and don't believe what I'm saying, because I think the more you do this research, the more you realize that the research is not fixed. So please see these not as rules or some kind of autocratic idea, but as perspectives that perhaps you have not considered as you've been thinking about the evaluation function. The goal today is to share research that has a bearing on how to optimize the impact of your evaluation findings. And in our question and answer session, I would love for you to just bring up anything that you think relates to this, anything ranging from anxiety and stress to thinking about communication, or any of the things that bring up questions for you. Now, what we know is that when you're doing an evaluation, you are doing an evaluation because you want something to change for the better. But we know that across all organizations, according to McKinsey and Company, 70% of change initiatives actually fail. And what Keller and Price found was that when you focus on mindset rather than changing a behavior, that actually gives you twice the likelihood of being successful, because somebody just performing a different behavior doesn't mean they're going to keep doing that. You really have to change the underlying mindset. And one of the things I say to people when they ask, is this a theory of business? And I say, well, businesses or the United Nations or the UNDP are made up of people, and people have brains. So if we're going to change anything that occurs in the UN function, we really have to change people and accordingly change brains as well. I'm going to be talking about 5 myths that very often come up. The first is, and they will sound counterintuitive, for a reason. And each of these, of course, is not an absolute truth, but there's another side to this that makes it more complex. The first is being clear about your goals. And I'm going to explain why that's a myth. Telling people what not to do, highlighting the goals of the evaluation process as the central issue, handing over a negative appraisal if that is the truth, and being transparent and speaking the truth, even if this causes stress. Now, if we look at the science of evaluation, the presumed goal of the evaluator is to share research-based findings in an objective manner that's received and acted upon in the service of the greater good. On the surface, it sounds really easy. You evaluate, you decide what's wrong and what's right, you communicate that, and then the person makes the changes and everything changes for the better. The problem is, this doesn't actually work that way. That when the evaluator is having a conversation with the recipient, it's a much more complex scenario. And the actions that occur are not a given just because you're communicating that. In the brain, you have 100 billion neurons and 100 trillion connections. So even what I'm saying right now is only representative of a small piece of my brain activity. Even what you're listening to right now is only representative of a small piece of your brain activity. Words are simply a representation, just one representation of neural activity. And what you're saying in the evaluation is conscious, but what is going on in your cognition in your brain is largely unconscious. In fact, probably more than 90% of what's going on is unconscious. Now, the implications are that when you are sitting there with an evaluand and you're sharing and they're hearing what you're saying, they don't have a blank canvas on which your information is landing. You are talking to a brain that has grown up through the years, that has stored memories, that has expectations, that has filters. So even now, as I'm speaking to each of you is hearing that differently because your brain is actually different. One of the concepts that I want to point out is that if you attend an evaluation, and let's say you're feeling annoyed with the person you're evaluating, but you decide you have to communicate the findings calmly, that unconscious emotion is actually felt by the other person because there's a process of mirroring occurring. So we now know that when I have a certain feeling and I'm feeling that, it sets up a pattern in my brain, and in your brain, there's a mirror that mirrors exactly what I'm feeling. So even if I try to sound calm, but underneath I'm seething with anger or I'm annoyed, you are going to feel that anger or annoyance. The language you use, no matter how objective sounding, is bathed in emotion. And the very nature of evaluation is really a very selective thing, right? You are selectively going to one particular idea and you believe you're communicating thought, but actually you're communicating both thought and emotion. Take a look at this video, which will describe to you what mirror neurons are about. And what I'd like you to be thinking about, in my last evaluation, what was I feeling and what might I have been causing the other person to mirror?
Perhaps because, and this is brand new science, this is just out of the lab, we may have some special circuitry in our brains that helps us whenever we look at each other. Ask yourself, why do people get so involved, so deeply, deeply involved with such anguish, such pain, such nail-biting tension over football?
Cleveland Browns are gambling on defense.
Why are we such suckers for sports? And it's not just sports. We can lose it completely at the movies, at video games, watching a dance. Is there something about humans particularly, that allows us to connect so deeply when we watch other people? Watch them moving, watch them playing, watch their faces. Well, as it happens, scientists have an explanation for this strange ability to connect. It's new.
It has never been found on a cellular level before.
A set of brain cells found on either side of the head. Among all the billions of long branching cells in our brain, these so-called mirror neurons have surprising power.
What we've found is the mechanism that underlies something which is absolutely fundamental to the way that we see other people in the world.
And it began entirely by accident at a laboratory in the lovely old city of Parma, Italy, where a group of brain researchers was working with monkeys. And they were testing a neuron, that's a brain cell, that always made this sound whenever the monkey would grab for a peanut. So the lab had all these peanuts around, and whenever the monkey made its move, the neuron would fire. Scientists thought, now here's a neuron that is essential to motion. It's a motor neuron. Then one day, the monkey was just sitting around, not moving at all, just sitting, when a human scientist came into the lab. And when that scientist grasped the peanut, the monkey's cell fired. Now, the monkey hadn't moved. It was the human that had moved, suggesting that this neuron up here couldn't tell the difference between seeing something and doing something. Seeing and doing were the same. Or more intriguingly, that for this neuron, watching somebody do something is just like doing it yourself. The head of the lab, Giacomo Rizzolatti, thought, wow.
The same neurons, one neuron, fire both when the monkey observes something and when monkey is doing something. It's almost unbelievable.
It's a people thing, too. We all know that humans learn by looking and copying. That's what infants do. First you look, you do.
Let's see your feet this way.
And once you've watched and copied and learned a set of moves, you not only have them in your head.
Look, you put your shoe on. Yeah, she brushed it.
If you see somebody else doing it, you can share the experience.
And I want to do it with me.
They know the moves, you know the moves, so you can move with them. That's why it's so easy to be a sports fan. But there is more, suggests UCLA professor Marco Iacoboni. He thinks mirror neurons tie us not just to other people's actions, but to other people's feelings.
So the idea was to try to figure out how the emotional system and this motor system are connected together.
And this is not in some abstract metaphorical sense. All that's separating you from him, from the other person, is your skin. Remove the skin, you experience that person's touch in your mind. You've dissolved the barrier between you and other human beings. And this, of course, is the basis of much of Eastern philosophy. And that is, there's no real independent self, aloof from other human beings, inspecting the world and inspecting other people. You're in fact connected, not just via Facebook and internet. You're actually quite literally connected by your neurons, and there's whole chains of neurons around this room talking to each other. And there is no real distinctiveness of your consciousness from somebody else's consciousness. And this is not mumbo jumbo philosophy. It emerges from our understanding of basic neuroscience.
And so if you think about your situations, right, the implications of that, when you deliver objective factors with anger or disdain, the recipient is going to mirror the anger or disdain automatically. And when you feel like you've got someone, even if you look calm, they can feel your intention and emotion. And so you might think, why are they not listening or why are they not following? But in fact, the mirror neurons are interrupting how they are receiving your information. So the conclusion here is, as an evaluator, it's important to clarify your emotions and intentions for yourself prior to meeting with an evaluator. So that's the first piece I'd like you to be thinking about, and ask yourself, will you take 5 minutes before you actually enter a situation where you're sharing information to check in on what you will be mirroring? So now let's just take a look at the first bit of evaluation, which is being clear about the goals. Now, obviously, clarity is important, and that's one side of it. But clarity is not everything. It does not ensure success, understanding, or interpretation by the listener. Boyatzis and colleagues found that if you coach for goals, if you say to somebody, listen, these are our goals and this is what we need to do, it's actually not as effective as compassion-directed coaching. That actually the person who's receiving the information will receive it differently. And another group of researchers, Jack and colleagues, found that there are two kinds of attractors, right, in the brain. They call these positive emotional attractors, where you as an evaluator are on the side of the other person and they can feel it. On the other is a negative emotional attractor, where you are focusing on the person's weaknesses and they can feel it. And what they find is that if you coach to correct the negative emotional attractor, it is not as helpful as actually coaching to the positivity of the other person. The idea here is that goal-directed coaching is fine up to a point, but then it starts to overactivate the sympathetic nervous system, and the fight or flight systems kick in, person becomes paralyzed and cannot act. Take a brief look at this video, which explains what this is about. A lot of people say, well, we're just offering constructive criticism, but constructive criticism is a much more complicated thing than those words suggest.
Change is stressful. Without change, we have no life, because the lack of change is, by definition, death. Our organizations worldwide are suffering from a motivation crisis. You are hardwired to pick up on the emotions of others. Now, here's the kicker. It happens in 8 to 40 thousandths of a second, according to Joseph Ledoux. That's deeply unconscious. And your dilemma is you can't help other people be open if you're not feeling open. You know, it's this whole unconscious contagion. Now, let's be clear about this. Constructive criticism is still criticism. Doesn't matter your intent. The person receiving it still feels like you're being a bully. But if you really want to incite some possible change, do it the way it worked for you. These things happen, you know what? You get filled with this positive energy, and you literally become positively infectious. And when we do that, we find in our families, in our communities, and at work, people coming together and doing things we never thought before were possible.
And so, so what is this compassionate coaching, right? I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, I'm fine, I'm neutral. But the question is, are you empathizing with the other person? Are you caring about the other person? And are you acting in response to the other person's feelings? Or is it a constant offense and defense interaction? Let's just take two overt examples. What a goal-directed evaluation would look like versus a compassion-oriented evaluation. In a goal-directed evaluation, you might say, according to the evaluation, we found the following gaps. In a compassion-oriented evaluation, you'd say, I'd like to discuss the findings about the evaluation and think with you about how to overcome the obstacles blocking progress on the front. In a goal-directed evaluation, you would say, objectively speaking, you scored X, Y, or Z. In a compassion-oriented evaluation, you'd say, I'm sure that this evaluation is missing something that you in the field experience differently. What is that? Because this is what we're picking up. In a goal-directed evaluation, you would say, so I hope that you will act on these gaps until next time. In a compassion-oriented evaluation, you would say, the actions we suggest are not guaranteed to give us the results we want, but they do open up possibilities for moving forward. And you can see, if you look in the left column, it's very sort of hardcore, here are the facts, pretending that in your brain, your thinking circuits and emotional circuits are not talking to each other. But actually, they're always talking to each other. There's no such thing as pure objectivity. Pure objectivity is a fetish that we like to believe we're capable of. There's a beautiful book by Antonio Damasio called Descartes' Error that explains why when Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, it's neurologically not feasible because the thought circuits and the emotion circuits are always talking to each other. So the conclusion in this portion is for you to ask yourself, is there more space for compassion in your delivery of evaluation findings? That's the first question. And you could say no, and that's fine, but this is just meant to really provoke questions in you. Are people mirroring your anger and disdain and overactivating their sympathetic nervous system rather than taking in the suggestions you offer? And there's just something for you to think about as you're thinking about your process. Now let's take a look at the second myth of evaluation, which is, I should tell people what not to do. Like, we should really stop doing this, do not do that. Well, what studies show, there's a concept called ironic process theory that was studied extensively by Daniel Wegner at Harvard. And what Wegner did first was he said, and I'd like you all to just try this out. I want you to just think right now. You don't have to think out loud, but just think of whatever you want to think for 30 seconds, but do not think about a white bear. So if you tell someone, do not think about a white bear, it's very hard to stop thinking about a white bear. You'll think about whatever you're thinking about, and count how many times white bear actually appears. So what he said was, it's interesting, if you try not to do something under stress, your brain actually does the opposite of that. And so many people have now researched and studied this and found that up to 80% of the general population have experienced intrusive, unwanted thoughts in their lives. And when you try to suppress something under stress, the brain activation is even greater. Other examples are, if you're at a party and you're holding a glass of red wine and you're walking past a white couch, why is it only when you're right by the couch that the wine somehow spills? It's partly because you're trying not to spill the wine. They've also looked at this in soccer players, and they find that when soccer players are scoring penalties, if they say, do not kick the ball to the right using eye tracking devices, the eye goes immediately to the right. So as you're framing for yourself and you're framing for others, ask yourself, if you're going to tell someone not to do something, I'm sure you've seen this in children as well, right? You say, do not put your fingers there. They'll go directly to the thing and put their fingers there. Even under stress, the brain doesn't have the ability to manage the stress and do the thing that you're not supposed to do. Implications for evaluation are, to avoid telling people what not to do and instead focus on what needs to be done. It's a very basic idea, but if the evaluant is suppressing a thought because they do not feel safe expressing it to you, they are likely to only focus on the thought that they're preoccupied by, and they don't feel psychologically safe. So the second question here for you is, do you deliver findings in the negative? Do you create psychologically safe environments where people feel open to expressing themselves? Because if they don't, they are likely not going to express themselves. So the first piece was about clarity and about how sometimes just being clear about the goals doesn't really help, because if there's no compassion, it's hard to receive the findings. The second piece has to do with avoiding using the word not under stress. The third piece has to do with the nature of goals themselves. I mean, being an evaluator or being in an evaluation office, goals always rise to the top because everyone's thinking, how do I get to this final goal? Like, how do I move through COVID and this crisis so that we can still reach our goals? Well, goals are important. The problem is, in the brain, as Aldous Huxley said, nor am I the captain of my soul, I am only its noisiest passenger. And really, what this translates to is that you've got 100 billion neurons in your brain. And let's say you say our goal is to reach X number of people with Y amount of money. Well, as that goal is going on, it's also interacting with other neural circuits, like the mirror circuits in your brain. And John Bargh and colleagues found that, in fact, goals are not guaranteed. Even if you say what a goal is, you are not guaranteed to reach it. Goals are selfish in the brain. Each goal competes with another goal. And goals are like independent soldiers in your brain, and the strongest one will win. For example, you might have a really strict diet goal, and your diet goal is a very sensible goal, right? I mean, for a lot of people, it's like, okay, it makes sense. I need to lose weight. I'll feel better. I'll be healthy. I'll live longer. Great goal. Well, your chocolate goal doesn't even need to work out. Your chocolate goal is so strong, if you like chocolate, that it's likely going to beat your diet goal. And so one of the things that happens is, if there's priming, it activates the chocolate goal. So for example, let's say you say, I'm definitely going to diet and I'm fine. And you manage to diet. You don't even have to think about the chocolate. If you enter somewhere and you smell the chocolate, immediately it activates and strengthens the chocolate goal. Now, what I'd like you to be thinking about is, when you're communicating goals to people you're evaluating, what are their chocolate goals, metaphorically speaking? What is competing with the goals that you are articulating? And the same for yourself. Bargh and colleagues also found that conscious purpose matters very little, that it's trumped by the listener being tempted to imitate you, withdraw from you, or shut down their motivation. So you go into an evaluation situation and you know what the feeling is like. You have a certain power, right? You're an independent evaluation office. You have a certain power. You're about to tell someone what they think about you. The brain is wired so that when they feel that impending attack, they start to withdraw. So you're speaking to them, but there's much more going on in their brains. They're withdrawing, they're shutting down their motivation if they feel threat. So an example would be that, if your evaluation shows that a person is not spending money on what is relevant to the sector, selfish goal theory says the evaluant hears your critique, is motivated to correct this, but also feels your anger and gets angry right back, withdraws from hearing you, and they would rather pay attention to something else. So it's sort of interesting, because if you say to yourself, I don't understand, why are they not following? This is like a very easy thing to understand. I am just saying, do this, and then that will happen. Sometimes that works out. But if you're in a situation where you realize this person they seem like they're not even listening to me, ask yourself, are they not listening to you because they're in such a defensive position that they're withdrawing from you and not hearing what you're saying? The implications here are to discuss the goals rather than simply stating them, and to ask about how the complexity of the situation prevents this goal from being achieved. One of the problems with evaluation, with any kind of evaluation, is even if you identify 25 or 30 factors, life is much more complex, right? There's what the person is bringing to work. It's whether they had a fight with their spouse. It's what happened on the way to work. It's what's happening with their financial situation. It's where their child is going to be going to school. It's about whether they've moved. It's about what's happening with COVID. There's so much going on in the brain at any one point in time. I'm not saying that you have to go in and be someone's psychiatrist and try to understand what's going on. But what I am saying is, it's important to be sensitive when you're delivering evaluation findings that it's not quite as simple as it looks. And so what might help is, rather than targeting all 25 things that you think need to be changed, are there target points in this complex system that affect other target points? So before you go into an evaluation, if you are evaluating 20 factors, what if 3 of them are connected to all of those other factors? Like, do you actually think about what those factors are? And is this something you can address rather than just addressing the goals? And then to talk about course correction strategies. And what I'm suggesting here is that you actually make the evaluation process more complex, rather than seeing yourself as a deliverer of information who spews information out in the presence of someone else. Is there a way in which you can understand the complexity of what's affecting what, so that you can have a discussion about that? The conclusion here is that in terms of asking questions, one of the things I'd like you to ask yourself is, do you have discussions about the complexity surrounding goals? And have you identified what is priming people going off course? The fourth myth has to do with negative appraisal, right? Handing over a negative appraisal if it is the truth. You discuss it, you look at it, and you say, look, this is just the truth. I'm sorry to tell you, but you're not up to scratch in these particular ways. Well, it's one thing to think that everybody will be able to hear your negative appraisal, but Knepp and colleagues actually found that when you give somebody negative feedback, their first response is that they actually mistrust you. They trust the accuracy of what you're giving, the feedback you're giving, and they tend to see you as not qualified. Now, you might think, I don't care, I am qualified, but why would you not care if the first response is mistrust? Then they're not going to be hearing the rest of what you're delivering, and the value of your findings is going to be lost. So part of what I'm asking you to do is to consider that when you give negative feedback, people immediately mistrust you. Any disagreement regarding past performance is greater following the feedback than before, because they start being defensive. So let's say they didn't do something, and then you say, hey, you didn't, what's with this thing? You didn't do this thing. Their first feeling, they start to disagree with you even more afterwards, because they're already in a mistrustful situation and they're defensive. They are also much more motivated to improve if the feedback conversation is focused on future actions rather than past performance. So while you do need to deliver the findings on past performance, part of what I will ask you to consider is, what about just reworking that in terms of the future conversation? And the notion of possibility is a really powerful notion, right? Possibility thinking means you switch with the evaluand from the logical circuit in the brain to a circuit called the default mode network. And the DMN, we used to think of it as the do mostly nothing network, but the DMN is actually part of the brain that starts to motivate people. You have an increase in dopamine, and people call it the crystal ball of the human brain. You start to, when you ask possibility questions like, well, what do you think is the highest bar we can achieve here? Can we raise the bar even higher? Is there a way we can work together to do that? The moment you start asking possibility questions, you are actually changing the way in which someone's brain works. And I'll give you an example of this. So there was an experiment that was done where they gave people three tubes, right? And the first, they all had the same neutral paste. The first tube was labeled lidocaine for pain relief. The second was labeled capsaicin, which is the active ingredient in chili. And the third was labeled neutral. Now, it's all the same neutral paste. The moment somebody saw the label lidocaine for pain relief, they said, wow, this is really calming. This is amazing. And when you looked in their brains, the reward center was activated. The moment somebody saw the label capsaicin, they expected that it was going to sting. It was the active ingredient in chili. They were like, wow, this stings a little. And you looked in the brain and the pain regions were turned on, and nothing happened in the neutral case. So when you expect something negative, the pain centers are activated, and everything that happens as a result of that expectation is related to that. So what I'm asking you to do here is to think about framing what you're saying in terms of possibility, not just in terms of, like this is what is wrong. And that's because if you want the findings to land effectively, this is another factor that is important to consider. The implications for evaluation here are that if you avoid starting an evaluation with what went wrong, it's actually helpful. You can also avoid the feeling that you are suddenly going to say, however, like you're going to say, well, the evaluation findings found that You've really met the targets as related to this. But every human being can sense when a however is coming up. And so I'm really asking you to consider, is there another way, like for everyone in the room, and this includes me in every function, like, is there a way we can up our game in terms of what we're delivering? And can we change some of these things? Can you be aware that if someone is self-protective or defensive, they will not hear you? If someone is sitting there in the room and they're like, okay, I keep on saying what you're saying, I'm not going to hear this, I'm not going to hear this, then your findings just fall on deaf ears. And so to make the findings more valuable, you want to also focus the feedback on future performance and challenges, and you want to be able to actually enhance what people are feeling about the future. As I said, it activates dopamine and also activates this feeling of motivation and also better feelings about the future. The biology of this is related to something that Lisa Feldman Barrett has studied. So for the longest time, we've believed that emotions are things that happen when you are in a situation that's triggered. But she has a very extensive body of data that shows that emotions are not deeply held feeling states that are triggered, whether you're feeling fear or happiness or anything that you're feeling, that the brain makes predictions all the time in order to mobilize resources to act. And that these prediction circuits can impact what actions people will choose. So if the evaluand is expecting that they're going to get a negative evaluation, their brain sets up a prediction circuit and they approach the evaluation in fear. So everything that they're hearing is going to be under the rubric of fear. And the pattern that you set for yourself and as an office and as a culture is going to be around fear. So what I find with organizations is that it's very hard for individuals to just make these changes. But as an evaluation office, I think the challenging question to ask is there a culture that you can see yourself being in that is not fear-based and that is not pseudo-objectivity based, but a culture that is aware of these prediction circuits and that is aware that emotions are predictions and that people are constantly in this predictive state. So the implications for evaluation here are that negative appraisals will make the person dread an evaluation every time. As a result, thinking will be unclear. They will not hear your helpful suggestions. They will act incompletely. And so for you, the question is, do you think, if I asked you, when you go to evaluate someone, are people really looking forward to it? Are they like, wow, I'm so excited to see you? Are they missing your helpful suggestions because they're in a state of fear where the brain cannot absorb that information? So that's another piece of information for you to consider. The final myth that I'd like to touch on is the myth of transparency. And here, we often say, just be transparent and speak the truth, even if this causes stress. Well, transparency helps up to a point. The reality is that every one of these myths is true in of itself, but what I'm revealing is that it's not entirely true because stress can really impact the brain. The first thing that stress does is it prompts habit behavior in brains. So if you think about it, you want to make a change. You say, let's make this change. But the moment you turn on stress in the brain at a certain level, obviously there are helpful things about stress. This is called eustress. EU stress is the helpful kind of stress. Distress is the thing that prompts this habit behavior in humans. And people will go back to doing exactly what they were doing before the evaluation. If you look at stress and habit, what you'll see is that when you are stressed, your body releases cortisol. And this cortisol turns off the active thinking circuit and it turns on the habit circuit. So often when someone is stressed, they're not even going to listen to what you're saying because the stress turns off the active thinking circuit. As a result, they go back to doing what they are used to doing, and you cannot access new neural systems. So for you to think about this, part of what you're doing, it's really quite profound, right? You're actually impacting this person's body and you're impacting their brain. One of the reasons I started this virtual reality company was because I wanted to highlight the fact that by reducing stress and anxiety, you can potentially reverse the negative changes on genes. Studies have shown that stress and anxiety lock genes. They call these epigenetic changes. And when they lock these genes, this is what predisposes to chronic disease, like cancer, heart disease, stroke, and neurodegenerative disease. So I gave a talk recently in Norway that was entitled, You Didn't Sign Up to Be a Doctor, But You Are. But the reality is that the stress that we cause ourselves and others is changing our genes, and it's also setting us up for chronic disease. So take a brief look at this video just to prompt some of those ideas and anchor them.
Are you sleeping restlessly, feeling irritable or moody, forgetting little things, and feeling overwhelmed and isolated? Don't worry, we've all been there. You're probably just stressed out. Stress isn't always a bad thing. It can be handy for a burst of extra energy and focus, like when you're playing a competitive sport or have to speak in public. But when it's continuous,
Where are you going?
I've
got a doctor's appointment before
day
too
in
long.
and day out, it
I've gotta
actually
go.
begins to change your brain. Chronic stress, like being overworked or having arguments at home, can affect brain size, structure, and how it functions, right down to the level of your genes. Stress begins with something called the hypothalamus-pituitary adrenal axis, a series of interactions between endocrine glands in the brain and on the kidney, which controls your body's reaction to stress. When your brain detects a stressful situation, your HPA axis is instantly activated and releases a hormone called cortisol, which primes your body for instant action. But high levels of cortisol over long periods of time wreak havoc on your brain. For example, chronic stress increases the activity level and number of neural connections in the amygdala, your brain's fear center. And as levels of cortisol rise, electric signals in your hippocampus, the part of the brain associated with learning, memories, and stress control, deteriorate. The hippocampus also inhibits the activity of the HPA axis, so when it weakens, so does your ability to control your stress. That's not all though. Cortisol can literally cause your brain to shrink in size. Too much of it results in the loss of synaptic connections between neurons and the shrinking of your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that regulates behaviors like concentration, decision-making, judgment, and social interaction. It also leads to fewer new brain cells being made in the hippocampus. This means chronic stress might make it harder for you to learn and remember things.
And so if you think about this in the context of an evaluation, right, both for yourself and the evaluant, if you are stressed or if your evaluant is stressed, it changes the brain's structure and function, and you have less capacity to think, make decisions, or change. Now, a lot of people will say, well, how can I not be stressed? Like, I'm in a high-stress job. It's not about the fact that the stress is not going to always be a constant threat. It's about your relationship with it and whether you are realizing on a day-to-day basis that this is actually changing your cellular matrix, it's changing your brain, and it's changing your body. So the implications for evaluation here are to approach the context as a stress-free zone, to connect with the excitement of your combined mission and vision, and to create a cognitively enhancing environment rather than one that stops the person or the recipient thinking. The conclusion here is your evaluation approach stress-free? Are you enhancing the cognition of yourself and the other person? And what are you actually doing to achieve this? Now, there's a lot to talk about here. I mean, part of what I do is talk about this kind of stress management, but I'm just highlighting the areas where I think you can actually take a look. So the summary and conclusions from these perspectives is that there are simple cognitions like be clear, mention the goals, be transparent. These are all simple, but the reality is that you are delivering evaluation findings from a very complex brain to a very complex brain. The first is, we say here what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, your head is not Vegas. What happens in your head does not stay in your head. You have mirror neurons, and we all have chains of mirror neurons. So we can all feel each other's heads in any kind of environment. There was actually one study done that looked at people who were in India and in France, and they were basically thinking Spanish words like hola. And what they found was that if they were dialed into the other person's internet, even if they couldn't see or hear them, the other person could reliably predict what they were thinking because that thought could travel along the internet to the other person. So thoughts are contagious. Goal-directed evaluations may overactivate the central nervous system. So ask yourself during the evaluation, can I add a little compassion to this? Avoid feedback about what not to do. Talk about goal complexity to address goal priming. Like, what are the three major things that are affecting everything else? Act so that people will look forward to your evaluations. And that's, of course, obviously very challenging. So I'm asking you to think, how could you change that? And I'm not even saying all of these things are things you have to do. These are just things to remember that are part of this complexity. And then to remember that whatever stress you cause will dampen the other person's cognition and probably hurt their brains and bodies. And remember, when we cause stress in others, their stress is getting mirrored in our brains. So we are picking up that stress as well. So ask yourself, how much of my honesty is being fed by hostility? How can I truly get alignment with the evaluand? Can I achieve success if we are not on the same team? Like, what does it mean to be an independent evaluation office? Should you be independent, so independent that you don't actually care about their goals? How can I get my value if not from intimidating others? You know, like, what would actually make you feel worthwhile besides the objective evaluation findings? Could the actual impact of your evaluation findings be more important than the feeling of intimidation as part of an identity? And are you truly independent? You know, it's a pretty, I think these are some of the complex questions I'm asking you to ask yourself. And I have here some of the books that I've written, some of which have been translated into Italian. Tinker Dabble Doodle Try is about the default mode network. Life Unlocked is about managing fear used by targeting your brain. And Your Brain in Business is about thinking about different business situations when you can actually target the brain for more effective results. And the Italian translation of Tinker Dabble Doodle Try is actually Il Potere del Cazzeggio, which is sort of a funny translation, but there is something about downtime that is very rich for the human brain. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take any questions or see if there's any comments in the chat. Did anything come up for you that resonated or that stood out as a potential change point for you?
Thank you very much, Srini. Stimulating as always. Let's allow the colleagues to react in the very valuable time and for the information you put together and brought it really great. Chitra on the chat.
No, thank you. I just say thank you so much. This was I think a really eye-opening talk, and I was in the Independent Office of Evaluation, and now I'm the evaluand, so I especially appreciate your message. And I guess again, I think it's I'll tread into the challenging space of there's this debate often between management and evaluation on learning versus accountability. I don't want to go into that, but I think a lot of what you're saying may fall into that space, right? Maybe we don't want to use that term. The term learning is loaded with some other connotations, but I think the point is that if we focus more on the shared impact, right? The change that we want to see. And I think it's a matter of how you bring the message. And if you bring it with that spirit of wanting a shared impact, I think that and I hear your message of then that might further actually realizing that, because in the end it is the evaluant who has to make that change and that impact. So I think that's appreciated. But I do think I just thought it's also very impressive. I'm just wondering then, so part of this, though, what you're saying, I feel is like a mindset change inside of the evaluator is what you're also seem to be saying. And I found that the most eye-opening, because it's not simply as an evaluator, but as a person, it's changing your mindset. So, and I think as a parent as well, I think that it resonated. So just to add my appreciation, and I don't know if it's enough just to hear the talk, and is it something that one has to always remind oneself of, because you're asking us to change inside. So I think that's quite deep, but and something to, I guess, we can all take on. And I'll remember not to say not, though, and to think positively and do that. So thank you.
Thank you, Chitra. I'll just take Monica and then give Srini a chance to respond. If anyone else opportunity for questions, just throw through. Monica, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the presentation. Very, very interesting. I was expecting you to also mention the effect of the communication with the evaluant, if you smile or not. because I'm a usually quite a smiley person, and some evaluators told me like, you sent a tough message, but the fact that you are smiling changed a little bit the ambience. So I think it's also something that we have to consider, especially to fight against evaluophobia. I think the experiences of some people in previous evaluations that were really tough or were like with big disagreement create some kind of barriers. And several times I've experienced this, that someone told me like, I was so afraid at the beginning because I had this very bad experience before in another organization or something. And I think it's also about the reputation of the evaluator. And people speak to each other, no? Like, oh no, this one was more reasonable, we could communicate better, or there was more flexibility. But at the same time, it's true that we have our own limits of what seems to be professional as an evaluator, especially independent evaluator, because you don't want to see or to be perceived as someone who is not providing like a very independent and detached view from people like managing. But I totally agree with this part of being humble, not saying like very positive is like, this is the truth and you are absolutely wrong, and dealing with complexity. And the last point I wanted to mention that I think is very relevant for our context is I'm a Spanish speaking person. Sometimes when I have to deliver a message in English, I will not have all the resources to maybe modulate my language, but I can engage better with someone in Spanish and be more like, approaching, and the same in French and so on. And I think sometimes I've noticed that there is this cultural barrier through language about how we communicate our own findings. Thank you, but very, very interesting presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Two deep questions. I'll let you respond to it. Chitra used to be with us and I joined and she left. So she's on the other end. We whispered to say she's crossed the floor, but she also knows that I'm trying to engage. And the whole communication strategy is this, to actually be reasonable, to improve the organization without compromising. But over to you.
Thank you. Well, Chitra, I appreciated your reflections and sort of reframing of some of what we talked about. And I think putting that in context, I think one of the questions you asked was, does it matter if we practice this? Like if we're making these mindset changes. So I have several thoughts about that. One is, I think practice is always helpful, because if you're living a generally stressed life, you're going to go back to habit, right? So you might want to ask yourself every Monday morning, or in the evenings, or before important meetings, have I reframed what I've done? I would say if you look at it more deeply, there is a concept which I sometimes teach in organizations especially when they're thinking about innovating, right? Because part of what we're talking about here is not like you need to change who you are. The question is, can you innovate in your leadership style? And can you change? And that change is, there's a model of that change that I think is particularly interesting called positive disintegration. And Kazimierz Dabrowski, who's a Polish psychiatrist and psychologist, studied gifted children. And what he found was that gifted children are frequently positively disintegrating. They blow up their whole identities and lives, and then they come back together again. They're like, okay, this is my new role. This is my new function. This is what I do. And then they do it for a while, and then they blow it up again, and they come back. But what he said was that when you are constantly comfortable with changing in that way, when you make a commitment to advancing yourself, you have to disintegrate to reintegrate. And he pointed out that 70% of the people in the world are living at the bottom level of this pyramid. Generally okay lives, they're socializing, reproducing, just going through the biological functions. But when you get to the next level is where you're slightly aware that something is a little bit off in your life, and you're thinking, I'd rather not get into that, so you don't get into that, but still unconsciously something's happening. Then you get to the third level where you are positively disintegrating. You said, wait a minute, there is a complete mismatch between who I am and what my value system is. Like, I value working, doing this, this, and this, and you start to disintegrate. At the fourth level, you actually start to make comments and make decisions based on your values. So you ask yourself, I think for all of us, and it's challenging when you're working within an organization as well, because you have to try to work with the organization's values and your own values as well. Like you may not value something, but you have to figure out how to fit that within an organizational context. But as a guide, as a navigator, I think it's really important. And then at the highest level is when you get up every day and pretty much everything you do is completely value driven. Now, at the UN, there's a core mission and vision that is very, very value driven, right? So we're not talking about going from level 1. You're already in this level 3, 4, 5 space. And now we're asking, how can you elevate that? So the reason I'm mentioning this is when we're thinking about change, the one question I'd like you to ask yourself is, am I prepared to positively disintegrate? Am I prepared to become a completely different person in order to open up different avenues? So for example, I recently had this realization, like we work in corporations and working in healthcare, and I realized healthcare is not set up to make people feel better, which was like such a startling realization. And I thought, we're living in an era of personalized medicine where we need large amounts of data quickly. Academics are used to taking their own time. They're like, oh, no. We'll see 24 patients in 3 years. This is not a system. And I was getting angry about that. But then I realized, wait a minute, rather than getting angry, why don't I just create my own system where we do things? So once I realized that was a value, I took on a much bigger challenge, but I realized that I'm much happier in that space of thinking about that challenge than cooperating with people. Or in corporations, for example, they have 50,000 firewalls. So by the time you collect any data to evaluate anything, you don't have enough data points. And so I thought, well, then this market is not really, if I really want to think about impacting people in the world, I have to think about somewhere where you're safe, but you don't have this degree of obstruction. So if you ask yourself, should I change? On the one level, practicing is helpful with these forms of self-talk. On the other hand, the deeper way to think about change is, do I want to, like if you reflect on those 5 things and you say, actually, I want to do something completely differently. And then you start doing it differently. Positive disintegration can really help you. So that would be my response to that question. I think with regard to what Monica was saying, absolutely. I think smiling helps. And when you were smiling authentically because it's part of who you are. And I think when it's authentic, it works. But there is this concept which a friend of mine labels yoga rage, where he says people go into, they're like, hi, how are you? Nice to see. And he's like, the people are smiling on the outside, but inside they're angry. And he's like, it's a little bit, it makes you're like, what are you doing? Like, what is this? Are you happy? Are you smiling? Are you angry? Because people are like, well, I just want to tell you, you actually haven't reached any of the targets we were supposed to reach. And that's really frustrating. It's sort of, then they're mirroring your anger, but they're looking at your face. It becomes a confusing interaction. So I think to your point about smiling, I think that that's very well taken. And I think when you can smile authentically and it's part of who you are, then I think that works well. I think with regard to the linguistic barriers, I think that that's real. And I would also ask you to think about how so often we get moved by singers who sing in languages when we don't even understand the languages, right? So why are we so moved by people when we don't understand the languages? It's because we're listening to their hearts, right? And there we are mirroring what's at their core. So what I tend to do, if I'm in a situation where I don't speak a language and I know that this is not gonna, I go back to what can I refine in my core feeling state? Because in that state, you want to be like that singer who can touch anyone around the world, no matter what language they speak. So that's what I would say to those 2 comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Srini. Colleagues, a chance for one more question, given the time. We have on platform. Alexander, so important person in the moment I came in, we worked on communications, Srini. You'd be very happy to know. So, and we've launched at multiple levels. And one of the things before Alexander comes in, we received a good commendation in the last job at UNDP, and you worked with us for 5 years there. Yeah. And when the administrator said, look, whilst you were independent, you also were engaging, we hit the sweet spot. But to hit the sweet spot is not easy. So it's much more complex than just being transactional. And it involves a psychological sophistication in how you engage as a leader and also as an evaluator with a lot of autonomy, and not just go along with your old methodology that is kind of like, quite out of date. But I'll have Alexander come in, who's been working very closely with me since I've started to actually deal with these issues. Alexander.
Thank you, Indran. I will be brief as we're nearing the end of the meeting. So I have a sort of direct, simple, so to speak, question. Obviously, I'm coming at it from a communications angle, as Indran introduced. So you mentioned about the brain shutting down. In other words, when you get negative comments, there's a negative approach, brain just shuts down, and then there's like no engagement, there's no interaction, they're just not hearing the message. So my question is, in terms of couching the messages, framing them, presenting them in such a way that the brain doesn't shut down, concern is, what about preemptive shutting down? In other words, I know that you're about to communicate something about evaluation. I have past experience with evaluation. I know everything is going to be negative. So you know what? I'm just not even going to engage with you, regardless of how you actually, how much effort you've put into framing this and presenting it. Doesn't matter. I'm preemptively shutting you down. So the question is, how do we get around that? Thank you.
So I think preemptive shutting down is a very real issue. It's got to do with those prediction circuits in the brain coming up, where they're predicting that something negative is going to come their way. So part of what I would suggest is something at a cultural level and at an individual level. So for the office itself, I think one possibility, which I think would be great, would be to start an evaluation by saying, as an office, we are very proud of our independent evaluation, and we historically, the way that the office has operated is as an office that delivers information so that something can be corrected. However, as an office, we've decided that we are really in this with you. And so we're going to be approaching this in a different way. So just to be super overt about it, I think it works really well if you make this change at a cultural level and you have a cultural alignment. That same Keller and Price research that McKinsey did found that alignment can increase effectiveness of delivery 4.4 times. So as an office, if you can focus on having an overt discussion about the commitment to this way of being, and you can find alignment, you're much more likely to be successful. So what I think is two things. One is, start out by just letting the person know what that is. And I think of this just as a model. Like if you are the evaluator and this is the evaluant, you're really looking for this Venn diagram, this piece in the middle, right? Where you want to maintain your independence, but you also want to share their understanding of the impact. And almost always, whatever evaluation finding you have, it's pretty, in some situations this happens, but it's pretty unlikely someone's just slacking away. Like they're just not doing anything. They're just sleeping. It's usually what happens is something mixes with that. They lose sight of this target. Something else is happening. There's a new thing that's happened. They've forgotten something. So acknowledging the complexity. So first is acknowledge the change in attitude. Secondly, acknowledging the complexity. And thirdly, using phrases like, I'd like to think with you about how we can interpret these findings. Because the interpretation of the findings, if you find a deficiency in two groups, the cause of the deficiency could be completely different. In one group, it could be because there's no funding. In another group, it could be because they can't get through to the key stakeholder in that community. So I think being able to discuss the findings authentically is a useful way to go about doing that.
Thank you very much, Srini. We had Mawira online. Is he still around? Or did he have to step off? No, I think he stepped off. So with that, colleagues, we've come to the end of the session. The recording will be made available and also the messages, etc. But Srini, once again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for taking the time to put together this really penetrating presentation. I've been working with you now for close to 10 years. When we started this conversation and this discussion, I had used what you've said in terms of leadership of a previous office, and we intend to do so as well here, also to bring about the shift. And I think it is totally possible. It's not incompatible to have independent evaluation and engagement and to improve the organization, because ultimately, as you yourself say, no one is slacking deliberately, right? And there's very few instances of malfide, but the sophistication of communication is something that's really important. I'd invite colleagues to, to look at the resources here. I'm sure we will continue the conversation in other avenues. The fact that Chitra is here, having crossed over to the other end, shows that we are keeping the bridges open. And I genuinely am committed to how do we use independent evaluation to improve IFAD so that it helps people on the ground. Thank you very much, colleagues, and let us give Srini a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.